Welcome to Storyverse, where stories speak and you learn English naturally.
Chapter 1. The Accident. The night was quiet, far too quiet for a Thursday in the small town of Crescent. The only sound was the steady hum of rain against the road, soft and rhythmic, like nature trying to soothe the unease that no one yet knew was coming. It was 7:45 p.m. when the headlights of a small white Honda flickered around the bend near the old bridge. Inside sat Karen Silkwood, a young lab technician with tired eyes and a determined heart. She had been driving for hours, clutching a brown envelope on the passenger seat, an envelope that, she believed, could change everything. Karen worked at the Kerr-McGee nuclear facility, a place she once trusted, a place she now feared. For weeks she had noticed things, strange things, missing samples, falsified records, and careless safety checks. She had seen her friends getting sick, their hands showing burns that didn't heal, and she knew deep down that something was terribly wrong. The company wasn't protecting its workers. It was hiding the truth. That night, she was supposed to meet 2 reporters and a union representative at a diner just outside town. Inside the envelope were the documents she had secretly copied from the plant's files. She wanted the world to know the truth, even if it meant putting herself in danger. As she drove, rain began to fall harder. The road glistened under her headlights, turning slick like glass. But Karen didn't slow down. She was running on adrenaline and fear. The windshield wipers beat back and forth like a heartbeat, thudding in sync with her thoughts. She thought about her friends at the plant, about how they had laughed together during lunch breaks, never realizing what was happening around them. She thought about the contamination checks, the radiation scanners that sometimes beeped without explanation, and how her own body had shown traces of plutonium. That was when she had made her decision to speak up, no matter the cost. A flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead, revealing the curve that led toward the bridge. Karen adjusted her grip on the steering wheel. The envelope beside her slid slightly, and she reached out to steady it. It was just a moment's distraction, but sometimes that's all it takes. A truck appeared from the opposite direction, its headlights blinding in the rain. Karen swerved instinctively. The tires skidded on the wet asphalt, and her car began to spin. She tried to regain control, her heart racing, but the guardrail came too fast. There was a loud crash, metal twisting, glass shattering, and then silence. By the time the police arrived, the rain had stopped. Her car lay overturned near the bridge, the front end crushed, the headlights flickering weakly. They found Karen inside, motionless. The officer in charge noted that there were no skid marks leading up to the crash, as if she hadn't even tried to brake. But the strangest part wasn't the car, or the broken glass scattered across the road. It was what wasn't there. The brown envelope was missing. The news spread quickly through the small town. Accident, they said. A tragic accident. But those who knew Karen, the friends she had trusted, didn't believe it. She had been careful, too careful, and that envelope had been everything to her. At the diner, 2 men sat waiting at a corner booth. Coffee cups had gone cold in their hands. One of them, a reporter named Mike, kept glancing at the clock. She was never late. When the phone behind the counter rang, the owner answered it, his face turning pale. He hung up slowly, then whispered the words that made the room fall silent. "There's been an accident. Mike pushed away from the table and ran out into the rain, his shoes splashing through puddles. He didn't care about the weather. He needed to see for himself. When he reached the bridge, flashing red and blue lights painted the road. The air smelled of gasoline and wet asphalt. An officer tried to stop him, but Mike shouted, "Her envelope! Where is it?" "She had documents." The officer shook his head. "Nothing like that was found." Mike looked down at the wreckage, his chest tightening. He knew she hadn't imagined it. Those papers were real. She had told him she'd copied safety reports, radiation logs, and internal memos that could expose the plant's negligence. Now, all of it was gone. Behind the flashing lights, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying away the last trace of Karen's voice. Somewhere in the darkness, her courage still lingered, a silent witness to the truth she had tried to tell. The next morning, the newspapers ran a small headline: "Local woman dies in car crash. Officials confirm accident." No mention of the documents. No mention of her work at the nuclear facility. But among her friends, the truth began to stir like a quiet storm. They knew Karen hadn't died for nothing. Someone wanted her silenced, and they had succeeded. But what they didn't know was that courage like hers doesn't fade with death. It leaves behind questions. It leaves behind a trail. And in that small Oklahoma town, under the gray morning sky, those questions were only just beginning. Chapter 2. The Factory. 2 years before that night on the bridge, Karen Silkwood stood at the gates of the Kerr-McGee nuclear facility in Crescent, Oklahoma, holding her lunchbox and her dreams. It was her first day. The factory rose like a gray fortress against the morning sky, tall chimneys, endless pipes, and a faint hum that never stopped. For a small-town girl, it felt like a world of opportunity. The pay was good, the benefits even better, and everyone said it was steady work. She had no reason to doubt them then. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of metal and detergent. Workers in white uniforms passed by, their badges clipped neatly to their pockets. A supervisor with a clipboard gave her a quick smile and handed her a dosimeter, a small black device used to measure radiation exposure. "Keep it on you at all times," he said casually. "Just a safety precaution." Karen nodded, not realizing that this little device would one day tell a story more frightening than she could imagine. The first few weeks went smoothly. She learned how to handle plutonium pellets, how to operate the glove boxes, and how to record data for the production logs. The work was repetitive but steady, and the hum of the machines became part of her daily rhythm. She was proud to be part of something important, something powerful. But the illusion of safety began to fade the day an alarm went off. It was just after lunch, when the piercing sound echoed through the plant. A shrill, metallic wail that froze everyone in place. "Contamination alert!" someone shouted. Workers dropped their tools and ran toward the decontamination area. Karen followed, heart pounding. Inside the showers, steam filled the air. Men and women scrubbed their hands, faces and hair with harsh soap, their skin turning red from the chemical burns. The water ran brown, then yellow. Some were crying. Others just stood silently, trembling. When it was over, Karen looked down at her hands. Tiny cuts from her gloves had turned raw. She asked her supervisor what had caused the alarm. He shrugged. Faulty reading, probably. Happens all the time. But she saw the fear in his eyes. From that day, Karen began to notice things. Safety reports went missing. Samples were retested without explanation. Sometimes her dosimeter spiked, but when she brought it up, the numbers were erased from the log. "We'll take care of it," they told her. "You don't need to worry about that." But she did worry, especially when she saw one of her co-workers, Linda, break down in tears after another contamination scare. Her hair had started falling out in patches. Doctors said it was stress, but everyone at the plant whispered otherwise. Karen began keeping notes. Every incident, every alarm, every odd instruction from management. She wrote it all down in a small spiral notebook she kept hidden in her locker. At first, it was just curiosity, but soon it became fear. One evening, she noticed something strange. The barrels of nuclear waste in the storage yard were stacked unevenly, leaking a faint greenish residue onto the floor. The next day, when she returned, the barrels were gone, replaced by fresh ones, perfectly sealed. She asked a foreman about it. He laughed. "You're seeing things, Silkwood. You worry too much." But she wasn't wrong. Later that week, 3 workers were rushed to the medical unit after inhaling contaminated dust. They weren't allowed to return to work for weeks. No one ever mentioned it again. As months passed, Karen's sense of trust began to crumble. She joined the union safety committee, hoping to bring attention to the growing number of accidents. But even there, she faced resistance. "Don't make trouble," one of the older workers warned her. "People who ask too many questions don't last long around here." Still, Karen couldn't stay silent. She started attending meetings after work, sharing her concerns with union representatives. That's when she met Drew Stevens, a kind man with a calm voice and tired eyes. He listened when no one else did. Together, they began collecting evidence: photographs, reports, test results, anything that proved what was really happening inside Kerr-McGee. Then came the night she found traces of plutonium on her hands, even though she hadn't worked in the contamination area. She followed the safety protocol, washing again and again. But the radiation readings stayed high. When the health officer arrived, he tested her locker. It was contaminated too. So was her house, her toothbrush, her kitchen, even the food in her refrigerator. Karen felt sick, not just from fear, but from betrayal. Someone had planted the material. She was sure of it. It was their way of warning her, of saying stop asking questions. But it was too late. The truth was already burning inside her like a fever she couldn't shake. At home, she sat by the window one night, looking out at the factory lights glowing in the distance. The same plant that once promised her stability now filled her with dread. She thought of her friends, the ones still working inside, unaware of how much danger surrounded them. She thought of the silence that protected the powerful, and the price of breaking it. The next morning, she returned to work, wearing the same calm expression as always. But something inside her had changed. She no longer believed the smiling supervisors or their empty reassurances. She had seen too much. As the shift siren sounded and the workers filed through the metal detectors, Karen paused for a moment, her badge reflecting the pale morning light. Somewhere deep in her mind, a quiet voice whispered, "They won't let you tell the truth." She didn't answer it. She just tightened her grip on her lunchbox and walked inside. The machines roared back to life, and the air filled once again with the hum of the unseen, the quiet danger that lived behind every wall. Chapter 3. The Union. The soft hum of machinery filled the Kerr-McGee plant. But to Karen Silkwood, it no longer sounded like work. It sounded like a warning. Every buzz, every alarm, every hurried step across the metal floor carried the same hidden message. Something is wrong here. By now, Karen had seen too many accidents brushed aside, too many contaminated readings quietly deleted from reports. Her coworkers were tired, frightened, and silent. Someone had to speak, and she decided that someone would be her. When the union elections came, Karen put her name forward. Some laughed at her. "A woman on the committee? Not gonna happen," one of the older technicians sneered. But when the votes were counted, the laughter stopped. Karen Silkwood became the first woman elected to the union's safety committee. It wasn't power she wanted. It was protection. Not for herself, but for everyone still working behind those steel doors. She carried a small spiral notebook in her pocket, the same one she'd been using to jot down her observations. But now it became her lifeline. Every alarm, every leak, every miscalibrated meter. She wrote it all down. Dates, times, witnesses. There were pages filled with shaky handwriting, underlined words, and little stars drawn beside the most serious incidents. At first, management ignored her questions. Then, they began to avoid her entirely. Reports she submitted were lost. Notes from meetings disappeared. Once, she found her locker broken into. Nothing stolen, but her notebook had clearly been moved. Someone had read it. One afternoon, she sat with her friend Drew Stevens in the small diner near the plant. He sipped his coffee slowly, eyes fixed on the raindrops sliding down the window. "They're watching you, Karen," he said quietly. "You know that, right?" She smiled faintly, trying to brush it off. Let them watch. Maybe they'll finally start listening. But deep down, she knew he was right. The factory floor grew colder as winter approached. Inside the glove boxes, the faint blue glow of plutonium dust reflected against the glass. Karen watched the workers handle it every day, sometimes without proper gear. The company claimed the radiation levels were safe, but the readings told another story. When she brought it up in the next union meeting, the room fell silent. Some nodded. Others looked away. A man at the far end of the table leaned forward and said, "Karen, we appreciate your concern, but you're stirring things up. We have to be careful. This isn't just about safety. It's politics, politics." The word stung. How could safety, the right to go home alive, be politics? Still, she refused to stop. In February, she was called to the medical lab for another contamination test. As the technician waved the detector near her hand, the needle shot off the scale. They tested again. Same result. Panic spread through the room. She was ordered into an emergency shower, scrubbing until her skin turned raw. Yet, the readings stayed dangerously high. When they tested her home later that evening, the same haunting sound echoed through the rooms. The steady click, click, click of radiation meters. Her clothes, her kitchen walls, her bed, all contaminated. It was impossible. She hadn't taken anything home. Someone must have planted it. That night, she sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling. The notebook lay open beside her. On one page, underlined twice, were the words, "Proof exists." They're covering it up. Days later, she received a quiet message from a union official in Washington, D.C. They'd heard about her reports and wanted evidence. Real, documented proof that Kerr-McGee was falsifying safety data and exposing workers to radiation. They told her to gather everything she could. If she could bring it to them, they'd take it to the press. Karen knew what that meant. It wasn't just about saving jobs anymore. It was about exposing the truth. A truth that powerful people would do anything to hide. She began collecting files from the plant, copies of exposure reports, medical test results, and internal memos. She worked late hours, sneaking documents into her bag when no one was watching. Each night, she returned home, placing them carefully in a brown envelope she kept hidden inside her kitchen drawer. The stress began to show. Her hands shook when she lit her cigarettes. She laughed less, slept little. But every time she thought about stopping, she remembered Linda, the coworker who'd lost her hair, the others who'd fallen sick, the silence that followed each incident. The factory that once gave her hope now filled her dreams with nightmares. She saw glowing rooms, locked doors, and barrels marked hazardous waste, stacked in secret storage yards. One evening, she told Drew everything about the union's request, the evidence she'd gathered, the fear that followed her everywhere. He looked at her, worry written all over his face. "Karen, they won't let this go." "You're walking into something dangerous." She nodded. "I know. But if I don't, no one else will." A week before her death, she held a meeting with 2 reporters from the New York Times. They agreed to meet her in Oklahoma City. Karen promised she'd bring all the documents, every piece of proof. "This will change everything," she told Drew as she packed the brown envelope into her car. But as the day grew closer, strange things began happening. Her tires were slashed. Her phone lines clicked with static. One night, she noticed a car following her home. Still, she didn't back down. On November 13th, 1974, she left for the meeting, the brown envelope resting on the seat beside her. Her friends never saw her alive again. Chapter 4. The Brown Envelope. The days after the contamination test felt heavier than ever for Karen Silkwood. The factory that once hummed with the sounds of routine now echoed with whispers. Whispers that stopped the moment she entered a room. People she'd worked beside for years suddenly looked the other way. Some offered nervous smiles. Others wouldn't meet her eyes at all. And yet, beneath the unease, Karen felt something else moving quietly. Fear. She wasn't sure whether it belonged to them or to herself. The radiation found in her home had made the news in small circles. Management claimed it was Karen's own carelessness. They said she'd smuggled contaminated material out of the plant, an accusation that turned her from whistleblower to suspect overnight. But she knew the truth. She hadn't taken anything. She'd been framed. Still, Karen refused to back down. The brown envelope she'd been building for weeks had now become her only weapon. Inside it were photographic negatives, handwritten notes, and safety reports. Each one proof that the factory was falsifying data and endangering workers' lives. Late at night, she sat at her kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged the photographs under a dim lamp. They showed rusted pipes, leaking containers, missing labels on radioactive drums, and glowing readings from meters that should have been silent. Her face reflected faintly in the silver frames. "They can't hide this forever," she whispered. But even as she spoke, she felt a presence watching. It started with small things. Phone calls that clicked and went silent when she answered. Headlights parked across the street for hours. The feeling of someone standing just out of sight. Once, As she drove home from a union meeting, she caught a glimpse of a dark car following her all the way to her driveway. Her friend Drew Stevens begged her to be careful. "They're trying to scare you, Karen." "And it's working." She shook her head. "If I stop now, it means they've won." Inside the plant, the tension thickened. Supervisors watched her closely, their questions laced with polite suspicion. "Still writing in that little notebook?" one of them asked one morning, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Always," she replied. By lunchtime, the rumor had spread. Karen Silkwood was being investigated for theft. When the plant's security team arrived at her workstation, they told her she needed another contamination check. Karen felt her stomach tighten. She knew what would come next. The Geiger counter began its slow, steady ticking, faint at first, then louder, sharper, faster. Her gloves, her hands, even her hair registered dangerously high readings. She was rushed to decontamination again. They scrubbed her arms until her skin burned, washed her hair until it tangled into knots. But the radiation clung stubbornly to her body, as if it had been placed there deliberately. Afterward, as she stood wrapped in a white towel, shivering under the fluorescent lights, a doctor murmured to another technician, "It's the third time this week. Same level, same spot." Karen looked up sharply. "What do you mean, same spot?" But they turned away, pretending not to hear. That night, she returned home to find her kitchen sealed off. Government inspectors in white suits moved carefully through the house, collecting samples. The beeping of radiation detectors filled the air, sharp, mechanical reminders of invisible danger. Her refrigerator, her plates, her bed, all contaminated. It was as if the walls themselves had betrayed her. "Someone planted it," she said to Drew, her voice breaking. "They're trying to prove I'm the problem." He nodded silently, but his eyes were filled with fear. From that day, Karen's life became a quiet battle for survival. Her phone calls were monitored, her movements shadowed, and even some of her friends began to distance themselves. Yet, she carried the brown envelope everywhere, never letting it out of her sight. Sometimes she'd place it on the passenger seat of her car, glancing at it every few minutes, as if afraid it might vanish. It had become more than evidence. It was her truth, her voice, her shield. But the weight of fear began to show. She started losing sleep, her hands shaking when she wrote. At work, she caught herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting someone to appear. One afternoon, she walked into the break room and found her locker open again. The notebook inside had been turned to a page she didn't remember writing on, and scrawled across it, in uneven letters, were 3 words that froze her blood. "Stop before Monday." She slammed the door shut, her heart pounding. She didn't tell anyone, not even Drew. The less they knew, the safer they'd be. Still, she couldn't stop. In the evenings, when the streets grew quiet, Karen would sit by her window, staring out at the empty road. Sometimes Birdie, the black crow that often perched near her apartment, would tap against the glass. A small, strange comfort in the loneliness that had taken over her life. By November, she had gathered enough material to expose the truth. The journalists from the New York Times had agreed to meet her in Oklahoma City. They'd arranged a dinner with union representatives to go over the evidence. The brown envelope sat on her table that morning, thick with papers and photographs. She ran her hand over it, feeling the faint texture of the sealed flap. "It's time," she whispered. But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the thought that someone already knew. As she left for work, a black sedan pulled away from the curb. Its tinted windows revealed nothing, but she could feel its gaze following her down the road. That night, when she came home, she noticed the window slightly open, and the brown envelope no longer where she'd left it. Her heart dropped. She tore through the house, searching the table, the drawers, the floor. Then, just as panic set in, she saw it. The envelope, sitting neatly on the counter, untouched. But something about it felt wrong. She picked it up slowly. Inside, the papers were perfectly stacked. Too perfectly. The photographs were still there, but the negatives were gone. Karen stood frozen, the realization sinking in like a cold wave. Someone had been inside. Someone had already seen everything. And somewhere, out there in the dark, they were waiting for her next move. Chapter 5. The Last Drive. The sky was dark and restless that evening. A November wind sweeping through the empty streets of Crescent, Oklahoma. The clock on the wall read 7:10 p.m. when Karen Silkwood picked up the brown envelope from her kitchen table one last time. It looked ordinary, just a faded paper folder sealed with tape, edges slightly worn. Yet inside it lay everything: photographs, reports, handwritten notes, fragments of truth that could shake an entire industry. She stared at it for a long moment, her reflection trembling faintly in the window beside her. The wind howled through the cracks, and the light above flickered, humming like a tired heartbeat. Her hands moved carefully, almost reverently, as she tucked the envelope into her brown leather handbag. "Just one more drive," she whispered. "Then it's over." She'd been invited to meet her boyfriend Drew Stevens, the union leader Jerry White, and a reporter from the New York Times at a hotel in Oklahoma City. They would finally see the evidence she had risked everything to collect. It was supposed to be a turning point, not an ending. Karen pulled on her gray jacket, grabbed her car keys, and paused by the door. Something in her chest ached, a strange, quiet unease. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a feeling that the walls were watching, that the air itself held secrets. As she stepped outside, the chill cut through her like glass. Her white Honda Civic waited in the driveway, dusted with the faint shimmer of dew. She got in, turned the key, and the engine coughed to life. The headlights sliced through the darkness, painting long shadows on the road ahead. She drove in silence for a while, the radio humming softly. A song about freedom, about running away. The kind of song that meant more when you were alone. Half an hour into the drive, Karen noticed headlights appear in her rearview mirror. Distant, steady, too consistent to be coincidence. She pressed the accelerator gently, testing them. The lights followed. She frowned, trying to calm her racing thoughts. "Don't be paranoid," she told herself. But deep down, she knew better. The road narrowed as it wound through the countryside. The headlights behind her drew closer, their glow spilling across the back seat like a warning. She could almost feel the driver's eyes on her. Karen tightened her grip on the steering wheel. The brown envelope sat on the seat beside her, silent and heavy. She thought of Drew, waiting at the hotel. She thought of the journalist, ready with questions. She thought of her children, and how she'd promised them she would come home soon. The road curved sharply near the Bridge Creek Bridge, where the fields dipped into darkness. She slowed, scanning the edge of the road, And that's when she saw it. A flash of chrome. The other car had pulled up beside her, close, too close. Her heart slammed against her ribs. No, she breathed. The headlights blinded her. She turned the wheel sharply to the right, tires screeching, gravel flying. The car swerved once, twice. Then everything went black. The sound was like thunder, steel twisting, glass exploding, the world folding in on itself. The Honda flipped across the asphalt, rolled down the embankment, and came to rest on its side near the bridge. The rain began to fall, soft and steady, washing away the dust and oil, whispering secrets no one would ever hear. By the time help arrived, it was too late. The officers found Karen slumped over the steering wheel, the headlights still faintly glowing against the trees. There was no sign of another car, no tire marks except hers. But the strangest thing wasn't the crash itself. It was what was missing. The brown envelope. The very one she had carried for weeks. The one filled with evidence and photographs. Was nowhere to be found. Police searched the wreck, the road, even the nearby fields. Nothing. Only scattered papers that meant little on their own. Fragments of words, smudged with rain. The official report called it an accident. They said Karen had fallen asleep at the wheel, or maybe lost control while speeding. They said she had no seatbelt on. They said there was no sign of foul play. But those who knew her, Drew, the union, her friends, they couldn't believe it. Karen wasn't reckless. She wasn't tired. She was determined. And that brown envelope had vanished into thin air. Weeks later, Drew visited the crash site. The grass had grown tall again, swaying in the cold breeze. He knelt by the broken guardrail, his hand brushing against a piece of shattered glass. In his mind, he could still hear her voice, calm, fierce, unshaken. They can't hide this forever. He looked down the empty road. The world had moved on. The case closed. The questions buried. But the truth still lingered like smoke, unseen but impossible to forget. Some said the envelope had been taken by the factory. Others believed the FBI had intercepted it before the meeting. Some whispered that Karen had hidden another copy somewhere, waiting for someone brave enough to find it. No one ever did. In the months that followed, her story spread quietly through newspapers and television screens. A young woman, dead at 28, fighting a battle no one wanted to see. Her courage inspired new investigations, new safety laws, and countless protests. Yet, for those who had known her, none of it could erase the silence left behind. The unanswered questions that echoed every time it rained on the bridge. Years later, a journalist visiting the site found a single piece of paper half buried in the mud, faded, brittle, the ink almost gone. Only one sentence could still be read. "If I don't make it, tell them why." The reporter folded it carefully, his hands trembling, and whispered to the wind, "We will, Karen. We will." And as the sun set behind the bridge, a crow soared high above the empty road, black wings cutting through the gold light, circling once before vanishing into the distance. The truth was gone. But her story, her fight, would never fade.